as well as a longer section about the Equal Rights Amendment and what happened to it and how these cases, Rita v. Reed, Fontiero, and Craig, relate to the Equal Rights Amendment. So there's 4 videos that'll cover the last class that we didn't do, and they're all online. So everyone has access to them. Literally everyone has access to them. So I'm going to move on to Personnel Administrator v. Feeney. All right. So what were the facts surrounding Personnel Administrator of Massachusetts v. Feeney in 79? So Massachusetts provided a law that veterans were to be considered for civil service positions ahead of non-veterans. So that's simply to say that veterans were given preferential treatment in terms of government jobs over non-veterans. Think of it as like affirmative action for veterans. It's a very common position that many states take. Now, obviously, especially considering the timeline, this works to extreme advantage of men and an extreme disadvantage to women. So particularly in the facts of this case, there was a woman who scored higher than male vets on the civil service exams, but was ranked lower because of this preference towards veterans. She thus sued and claimed that her rights to equal protection were violated, so her 14th Amendment rights were violated. And so the question in this case is, does this preferential treatment for veterans violate the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause as discrimination on the basis of gender? And the answer the Supreme Court gives is no. In this particularized case, it doesn't. They said that even though the law does ultimately benefit men, that the law on its face is neutral, that the law doesn't make any distinction between men or women. At this time, there were female veterans, and female veterans received the same preferential treatment as male veterans. So the law was neutral in terms of how it was written and how it was applied. And since the equal protection just requires equal law and not equal results, that this law in question, this ruling in question, survives the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. Furthermore, in the majority opinion that Justice Stewart writes, he goes on to say that obviously this law bears a substantial relation to an important and legitimate governmental objective, and that substantial relation to an important legitimate governmental objective is what is known as the intermediate scrutiny test. Go back and look at the previous videos. Therefore, the majority in this case uses this intermediate scrutiny test to determine whether this regulation discriminates on the basis of gender. They find that it absolutely does not, but they also go further to argue why this intermediate scrutiny test is actually appropriate in this case. And they answer to a bit more degree than they do in Craig v. Bourne. They argue that gender-based classifications shouldn't be subject to strict scrutiny because a racial classification, regardless of purported motivation, is presumably invalid and can be upheld only upon an extraordinary justification. But gender-based distinctions don't rise to that level. That some gender-based restrictions are not presumptively invalid. In fact, that decision, that mindset would be wrong-headed, the court argues. So they argue that strict scrutiny is absolutely not appropriate, but something higher than rational basis is, and in this case, as established in Craig v. Bourne, this intermediate level of scrutiny is absolutely appropriate. 2 judges dissent, Justice Marshall and Justice Brennan. They seem to agree with the majority about the type of scrutiny to be used. So the 2 judges in dissent, Marshall and Brennan, agree that intermediate scrutiny should be used, but they disagree in the outcome. And they say this because the statutory schemes bears no substantial relation to a legitimate governmental interest, and it can therefore not withstand scrutiny under the Equal Protection Clause. So we have judges disagreeing with regard to the outcome of the case, but the important part, especially in the wake of Craig v. Bourne and previous cases in this area, is that everyone agrees that intermediate scrutiny, or this heightened scrutiny level, is what is appropriate to apply in gender-based discrimination cases. And so the important part is that from Craig v. Bourne, which happens in 76 to 1979, the court in its entirety gets on board with the idea that intermediate scrutiny is the method by which one reviews laws that may discriminate on the basis of gender, that it isn't strict scrutiny, it isn't rational basis, but intermediate scrutiny is the appropriate standard going forward.